everybody. Great to be with you and see some familiar faces and some familiar names on the list, and exciting to have a bunch of people that I haven't yet met before be on this webinar with us. Let me also kick off by acknowledging the Dharawal people whose country I am based, and pay my respects to elders past, present, and of course emerging. I also want to acknowledge Ngunnawal country where David Crosbie is, and I'll introduce David in a moment. And also let me pay my respects to the traditional owners of wherever you may be across this beautiful country of ours. We are going to have an interesting discussion, David and I hope it's interesting, around our charity sector. A lot of you, I noticed, will be already working with and for the charity sector, and so I'm looking forward to some great questions and comments that we might get along the way. Many of you will be well familiar with the incredible work that our charity sector have been doing since COVID-19, and of course in the past, to support our communities, to support their beneficiaries, and to be effective advocates to governments. And we've seen governments respond quite incredibly to the advocacy work that charities and others have been doing during this time. But we are all acutely aware that that future is far from secure. It's far from certain. We know that some very good charities may not survive this COVID period and beyond. And charities are already starting to look at how they operate and the services that they may offer. We know the pandemic will have an impact in years to come across our society in many different ways and in many different sectors and social issue areas, including for our charities and our charity sector. So that brings us to why David and I are here today to talk about building back better. And we want to frame this discussion around past, present, and importantly, future, around our charities' survival, their contribution, and how we maintain the important role and value they play in the wake of COVID-19. So before we start with a Q&A with David and I, let me introduce David Crosbie. Many of you will know David very well, but for those of you who don't, he's the CEO of the Community Council for Australia. He has been in this role for a number of years, but has 20 years as a CEO for various charities, including the Mental Health Council of Australia, Alcohol and Other Drugs Council of Australia, Odyssey House Victoria. He has and has had a number of board roles in the charity space, including, among others, he was an inaugural member of the advisory board of the Australian Charities and Not-for-Profits Commission. And he's also one of the founders and members of the Charities Crisis Cabinet that we have formed. Anyone that knows David knows he's incredibly passionate. Anyone that doesn't know David will feel and hopefully hear his passion at the end of this webinar. Welcome, David.
Thanks, Kristy, and it's great to be here, and I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Great. So I'm going to kick off with let's talk about the past just for a moment, David, and talk about the role that charities have been playing in society. From your perspective, what do you see as has been the fundamental role of charities for Australian society?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question, because when you travel around the world and visit other countries and talk to them about their charity sector, it's nowhere near as involved in service provision, particularly government service provision directly, as it is in Australia. But it also stems from a very strong church background. So around 30% of our charities have a religious origin. We in Australia, I think, have become an integral part of the service system in a way that I don't see anywhere else around the world. I think that over time, we've faced an incredible period of growth, which has been followed by a period of, I think, stalling income streams. So if you look from 2007 to 2017, you know, we went from 750,000 staff to 1.3 million staff, and our turnover went from like 46 billion to around 150 billion. So we had this massive period of growth. But your research, Kristy, you know, when you looked at the organisations on the ACNC register and compared 2014, 2015 income, actually showed that there wasn't a significant growth at all for most charities, and that the big end of town, the universities and others, may have been growing quickly, but not so much the average charity. And I think this gets to the first sort of core point, which is that charities were probably facing a bit of a tipping point prior to the bushfires and prior to COVID-19. So when we think about building back to a time when fundraising revenues in terms of how much you have to invest to get fundraising returns were actually at their lowest for some time. And many of the big charities were still making their donations targets, but they were spending more to achieve that. Revenue from fees and services and charges have become super competitive, often with for-profits now operating in spaces that were previously mostly charities. And government year-on-year incomes in programs and services were getting much harder to get. And in some cases, there was a sort of culture of short-term rollover rather than make decisions, which I think meant that we were at a bit of a tipping point prior to the bushfires. And, when I talk with key charities, November, December, January were the worst fundraising periods they'd had, except if they were involved in bushfires. So we're already facing some pretty big challenges.
You brought up a whole lot of issues there, David, and I'm going to pick back up on a bunch of them, including funding models and marketisation, short-termism, a whole bunch of things that you talked about, and issues around growth and what does that mean and for who. On that role of charities, I think it's interesting, that historical piece that you've just pointed out, and where they emerge from, the church background, and actually sort of, I guess we were historically at a point of abdication of social responsibility by government, hence that result that you just described around, in Australia, we have a service system that's effectively got charities in Australia serving our most vulnerable population groups. Probably everyone on this call is familiar with this, but I think it's also just worth adding the piece that almost every aspect of our lives is touched by charity or charities and not-for-profits. And I think one of the interesting things that I've seen in COVID online in terms of public perception is all of a sudden people are really valuing some of those formal and informal charities that are just part of their communities that they'd never really thought about as being charities before. In terms of our sporting organisations, our museums, not being able to turn up and be part of those cultural events that might be in your community, some of the things that religious groups might be providing, local choirs, even just aspects around care for our kids, etc. And so I guess what that brings me to, David, is how do you think charities are being perceived in Australia by the general public?
I think the bushfires and COVID-19 have increased our sense of belonging to a community because, and I mean a geographic community. I mean, we lived lives where we might live somewhere, but often our kids went to school somewhere else. We played sports somewhere else, or took our recreation somewhere else. We'd go and watch art and performance somewhere else. We belonged to groups that met elsewhere. The sense in which we were part of a place, I think, had diminished from 30, 40 years ago, when you were part of a town, or mostly regional or rural towns were more common in terms of population base. So we were connected locally. I think we've become a bit disconnected locally. But bushfires and the COVID-19 issues and the lockdown have made neighbours much more important than they've been for some time. I think connecting locally, access to support, even if it's petrol and food, as we saw through the bushfires locally, supporting local business, supporting local initiatives, have become much more critical and front of mind in people's, even their expenditure. If I can choose to go to a big supermarket or support my IGA that had toilet paper through the COVID lockdown toilet paper shortage, what do I do? So I think we're focusing more locally, and we're recognising the value of community locally, and we're recognising the value of local relationships. And that translates into support for charities depending on the charity involved. So there is an argument that, talking with the head of Oz Harvest, their current fundraising is actually doing better than any previous fundraiser. They provide food to people in need, and people can see that there's a high need for that. If you look at like Red Cross, RSPCA, groups like that, they're actually increasing their income and support from the community. But against that, what does that mean for international aid groups? What does that mean for a whole range of other charities that aren't in emergency responses and maybe don't have a universal local footprint? And so for most charities, I'm not sure whether the positive feeling about caregiving, about first responders and healthcare workers, I'm not sure how that will play out in terms of whether or not that will mean increased support. I do think there is, and I'll stop on this point, Kristy, there's a much stronger case for charities to focus on engagement. And I mean engagement with their communities. Because I think it's pretty clear, just as communities have learned around local engagement, how important it is in a crisis. I think charities need to learn that lesson and recognise that engagement is a protection against vulnerability.
I think that's really interesting, particularly for charities that might be national or across multiple states, or even charities that are place-based, and we'll get to, what does this mean for small charities, because we know they're particularly vulnerable. But your points around this sort of like that people have more of a sense of place and trust within that place, and a reciprocal nature of going, actually, I really need to support my local community, and I might buy my toilet paper here instead of where I was getting it previously, by seeing ramped up. And I wonder what that's going to do for trust, and how do charities play with that, or engage with that in terms of this Build Back Better and what the future might look like. Because if we look at the trust statistics, so let's go back to the bushfire period. We have had, and if we go back before that, the Edelman Trust Index, whether you love it or hate it methodologically, it's quite useful to go, is trust changing for institutions longitudinally, and what does that look like for government and business and charities, and how do we compare that? So if we look at that over time, trusting charities has been pretty ordinary, to be honest. It largely comes out at around that somewhere between 50 to 57% over the last 3 or so years. It was 55% of the general public who trusted NGOs in the 2020 Edelman Trust Index that came out in February. So if we look at those numbers, and then we look at, and again, this is institutional trust, not trust of local charities that have the heart and soul of an individual going, I know these people, I'm going to give to them. So if we look at also then, we take those numbers, and then we look at what happened in the bushfires with the likes of, say, the Red Cross, and we saw enormous public support for people giving at the start of the bushfire, and then we saw this massive flip in terms of the public having this perception, and again, generalising, this perception that their trust had been breached because what they thought they were giving money to wasn't happening, or wasn't happening quick enough, or whatever else. So, what do you think about those levels of trust, and how might charities actually build trust, whether they exist in a local sense and or a more national one?
They're really good points, Kristy. I think Edelman have just done a May update. They didn't do all the countries; they did about 12. So it's not, it's not that rigorous, but what we saw, as you would expect, is a massive increase, the biggest ever increase in support for government. Trust in government went up by over 11%, and trust in media went up. And I don't know whether I find it remarkable now, the number of people who are actually going directly to media sources. I mean, The Guardian now has an 11 million readership. So at the very time when media outlets are losing their revenue from advertising, they have never been more watched, in the last 5 years. News services are really booming. Even within our sector, pro bono has bigger readership than ever before. So I think there is a thirst for knowledge. The standing of experts has gone up significantly in the Edelman Trust Indicator. I also think whenever you go through these crises, and I learned this from Tim Costello and others who've spent a lot of time going to places in crisis and seeing the initial reaction and then the follow-up reaction. almost invariably that sort of first crisis impact is about concern and trying to immediately support people, and there's a sort of coming together and a very positive kind of approach to we can do this, we can support. But then almost invariably that's followed by anger, that the recovery is more complex than we thought. And it goes to this Build Back Better, which is a very common theme in international aid. You know, if floods have been wiping out a road, do you put the road back where the floods are going to come again, or do you try and reroute the road so that it's no longer susceptible to flooding? And many overseas aid organisations have been working on this basis for many years. That whole concept that you don't replicate where things have failed, just as we're talking about whether we build houses back in bushland, and if we do, how we do that. That introduces a level of complexity that makes immediate responses quite difficult. And, you know, that's what we've seen. That's been compounded. And I think we need to name this, Kristy. There are a small minority of people in the National Party and in the Liberal Party who oppose charities. And I say that meaning oppose charities. They don't like the idea that charities enjoy higher trust than they do and than governments do. And some have specifically said that they would like to see trust in governments, trust in charities reduced. And I know some, including at least one minister, who said the opportunity to criticise charities around the bushfires is in their political interests. So if they will pursue that. So that we were so concerned about some of the feedback we were getting about what seemed to us to be almost a campaign to undermine the effectiveness of those charities, that we started meeting with some of those emergency response charities. And we've been talking about how we push back against those campaigns that are there to actually undermine charities. That's not all, but it's part of the picture in which I think we have to take into account when we're looking at where charities are in the public discourse.
I think it's a really interesting point, and I think we need to be thinking about what that public discourse looks like and how we, as individuals who are part of and actually are for charities, use that discourse and think about our language. I mean, one of the things that I've been worried about, and let's get on to the future in a moment, but I've been worried about, you know, the strong push around the economic value. Now, we use it all the time too, and it's really important that we hold that, because that's an important message for a whole group of people. So it's a bit out of date now, but, you know, Deloitte Economics did a piece a couple of years ago where they valued the economic contribution of the charity sector at $129 billion. And we know what the revenue lines are through the ACNC, but this is sort of like just valuing the economic contribution piece. And then on top of that, you know, we obviously know that charities employ around 1.3 million people. They're one of the largest industries that we have. If we were to categorise them amongst our industries, we've got around 3 million volunteers. So, and those volunteer hours are worth an enormous amount of money if you put a dollar value on those. So economically, we know charities play a really strong role, but I'm wondering, in that public discourse piece, in the Build Back Better phase, do we need to push the value of charities from this value? And I've heard you talk quite strongly about the values that charities bring to the world. Do a piece of work around that to shift the public discourse, David?
I think we need both. I certainly think we need, I mean, I don't like the notion that we're serving the economy and that we're all individual little economic units, and that's our purpose. But at the same time, I recognise that if you can't enter into that discourse, you are going to be excluded from many major policy discussions. So I like to frame that around productivity. And I think charities boost productivity, and they themselves could be more productive if we actually invested more in their capacity. I mean, one of the big problems we have in the charity sector, and we've seen it, you know, during COVID-19, is that, you know, often charities need to pivot to online because they can no longer do face-to-face. But that requires a set of resources, skills, software, hardware, and a capacity that some have, many have, but many don't. So how do we, if we want them to continue being productive and doing their valuable work, how do we inject that initial capital that will provide a productivity boost over time? And we can think about that in almost every aspect of the way charities operate. We could do things better if we had investment and support to do things better. The other, I think, really critical point to make here, what is it that charities get rewarded for? You know, what's the, in a sense, where we're operating in an environment, what kind of benefits do you get if you can show you have strong values? What kind of benefits do you get if you can show that you provide an economic outcome? You get someone into work, or you keep someone at school, or and it's very clear that being able to demonstrate your value is important in terms of the emotional connection that matters in giving and in community support. But in terms of government support, it's the economic arguments that seem to be more significant even now. So I like to think of this as having sort of a kind of formula. I think of EP cubed. So we need evidence. We need to be linked into the policy agenda. We need public support. And we also need personal connection. And I think if you've got those four elements in support of your sector, you've got evidence, it aligns with the sort of policy directions of government, building back the economy and building back communities. It aligns with the personal connections of politicians, you know, they're involved in charities, or whatever personal connections they have, their trusted advisors are involved in charities. And if it aligns with public interest, then you have a chance. If any of those elements is missing, evidence, public support, politics, policy direction, or the personal connection, you're going to struggle. And often we see this, you know, being in Canberra and often supporting members before or after they go and see ministers. People go in and think the evidence alone is enough, or the fact that they've got public support is enough, or the fact that this aligns with a policy statement by a minister is enough, or their personal ambition, which is part of that same policy direction. You know, I often say to people, well, you know, you've got a really good case, but I don't think that will mean that anything will change. And people will listen to you and they'll be supportive, and they'll agree with you and say how much they value your work, but nothing will change. Yeah. And the question here is, what is it that we need to do as a charity sector to ensure that we're not just, you know, sort of patted on the head like the youngest child and sent off to play on our own while the adults have a conversation. And there is that feeling at the moment around the future of Australia and the policy directions that the government is formulating, that, you know, we are the sort of the youngest child that's being left to play on their iPads while the serious people have a discussion about where the country's going.
Yeah, which is kind of interesting. I wonder whether there's a disconnect there around where the country's going and what kind of future that we actually might want. I mean, it's interesting because the public discourse has sort of started to move a bit away from all about the economy, and yet, I guess from the government perspective, you know, we've seen the Treasurer come out and say that the numbers are sobering. There's been a prediction of around a $360 billion cash deficit in the next financial year, and in 2022 and 2023 in total. How do charities position themselves and not get left behind in that future around the funding piece, particularly when we're coming from a history of market forces where they've been, you know, charities have largely been forced to compete for the dollar, where governments have abdicated responsibility historically and charities are doing a whole lot of the service sector. And also we're in a position where we know that a lot of charities have had to cross-subsidise to do that servicing and be competitive to win the tenders. So we're already starting from behind in terms of that funding model. And we've got to worry around the future economics of the country and what gets prioritised. So how do we, in this Build Back Better, what do you think are the key things? And I like your formula, but is there anything else we need to think about around financial viability of the charity sector going forward?
Yeah, look, I do think that the government is going to withdraw funding as much as it possibly can. I mean, it's made that very clear. I think Scott Morrison walked out of one of the national cabinets and said, we don't see this as a government-led recovery post-COVID. We see it as a business-led recovery post-COVID. And already the indicators are that that's the focus. I think our role, we probably started off in the same position in terms of the COVID response. We weren't even part of what was considered the response to support Australian businesses. We managed to, by, I think, singing with many voices and approaching the government in many different ways, with many different kinds of arguments, but all, a similar tune, but different voices, some discordant, which made the choir sound even better to me. And I think the more we get that kind of collective peak bodies, I've never seen the level to which all the peak bodies were working together around JobKeeper and eligibility, and not since we battled to keep the ACNC. I think the sector really rallied around ensuring that we tried to get as much support as we could, and I think that kind of effort is needed again. But it also needs to be supported by, I think, quite strategic community engagement from charities. It's a bit like, I don't think you can have a mass media campaign, promoting the sale of a certain ice cream. If you haven't got that ice cream in every shop around the country, you're not going to boost sales. We need to have the sort of local level engagement be strengthened. And I think there's opportunities to do that come out of this increased sense of place. And that provides the bedrock for the broader campaigns around our value, which is both economic and social and well-being. I think if we go back to the Productivity Commission inquiry into what we contribute, Robert Fitzgerald often says the most important chapter was chapter 3. And it was certainly the chapter they emphasised. The first 2 were describing what they did, really. And chapter 3 is about evaluation in the sector. And he thinks the most important page in that report is the table that talks about how we measure our value and our activity. And that, historically we used to be funded and measure our activity by inputs. We went to outputs. We're moving to outcomes. He said, until we get to impact, we won't be valued. So I think it's appropriate, given that we're talking about impact, and this is an impact, in a sense, an impact conference, that we recognise that we need to get there as well. But that doesn't mean that we don't focus on impact at a local level as the bedrock for that.
Yeah, I really like that. And I think, and a shout out to all the volunteers in Volunteering Week. Not just this week, they're important, but they're important all of the time. And the formal volunteers and the informal ones who just go about and do charity by being kind and good and supporting neighbours and family and friends and community. So I really like that bedrock piece, because it comes back to the fundamental nature of how society functions. So in terms of this, and I want to make sure we've got heaps of time for Q&A, and if we don't have enough questions, you and I can natter for ages, David. But I want to ask you, if you had to come up with the ingredients for Build Back Better, so if we were to come up with, 5 big things that we would want to focus on if we're trying to envisage what Build Back Better looks like. You've mentioned, an increased focus just now on outcomes and impact. And that's, I think that's really key. And obviously I'm biased because I'm an academic and it's what we do. But I also think it's the heart of, the whole point of charities. They're for public good. So it's really key. And we've also talked about shifts in financial viability and how we might think differently about that going forward. What would be some of the other, if you had to pick 5 things, if you envisaged what a Build Back Better would look like, what would they be, David?
I think the fundamental one is what gets rewarded in our sector. And I think we need to make sure that our focus is on our purpose. I think often charities, and I've run many programs in my life, both as a CEO but also as a worker, and you do tend to become passengers in your own programs. When I travel overseas or talk to people in Canada or the US or the UK about what work they do in their charity, they're much more, it seems to me, focused on impact and outcomes. They'll often have elevator statements about how their work means that, because, I'll give you an example, in Ottawa, the early childhood people will say that because they're better preparing children for school, every year they're boosting Ottawa's productivity by 2%, and no kid goes to school without being able to recognise numbers and letters. And, they talk about impact in a very real way. When I ask people in Australia what they do in their charity, I'll often get a program description. We run this program for kids in the morning. We come in and we do some literacy, and we teach them how to cook basic things, and we do this and that. And I think we are very program focused. It's both a strength and a weakness. And I think in terms of positioning our sector, we need to be focused more on the outcome and thinking more about the communities we serve and how we could do that better. And I think when we do that, we may well free up some resources. Running a large drug treatment service that got part of its funding for running a big residential program, I would sometimes sit down with all the staff and say, okay, we're getting $3 million a year to run this particular program. If I had that $3 million to reduce drug use in our region, would you use it this way? And if not, how would you use it? And we don't often do that thinking because, no, this is what we do. We run these programs. We offer these services. And so I think that sense of refocusing on your purpose and how the resources that we have in our agencies can be used to better achieve those purposes is a starting point. And I think that then ties into the other things we need to do better, which is collaboration and working across, not just within our sectors, but across sectors. Why aren't housing, mental health and employment programs all linked? Because I can tell you they're linked in real people's lives and they're the things that matter most. But yet, we'll have a mental health program, we'll have a housing program, we'll have it. So I think we need to collaborate much better. We need to pool our resources better. We need to demonstrate our value better in terms of the people we serve. Kristy, I think there's a lot of work to be done in that outcome space. And I think we need to change the funding models by being more determined about what we will or won't do. We need to say no more often. I noticed today that the group that does all the testing for COVID-19, the pathology and their peak body, got their payment for a COVID-19 test has been backdated. There's an increase. It's been backdated to March, the start of March, from $25 to $100. And they got that deal by saying they would withdraw all COVID testing unless they would. And it's written up as a hard-nosed negotiation with the government. And I was thinking, how often do we have hard-nosed negotiations with the government in the charity sector?
I think that's a really interesting point, because the hard-nosed negotiation and what that means for how you, what I think, going back to your point, David, what do you say no to?
Yep.
And how do we take back a bit of that power? I mean, obviously, I'm not being flippant here. I worked for, we are a charity, and I've worked for the charity sector for like 30 years. So I completely get that, we often don't hold the power, but which bits can we take back? And there's a really great example in one of the governance for social impact courses we taught where a group of, and I won't name any organisations, but a group of CEOs with their board chairs went to the government department and said, we're no longer accepting this particular contract because the rate is not sufficient for us to deliver quality services to our people. So none of us are going to tender. Guess what happened? Government increased the rate where that happened. Interestingly, we had another issue emerge, which I won't name the issue area or the people either. And one person and a group agreed to that. They all went to front up to government and only one person was left at the altar. And of course, what happened? It went ahead as it always does. So it's really interesting around how and when you can kind of say no and take that power back. I mean, one of the things that we do at CSI is say no where we don't have return license. Because actually, if we can't share findings, I want to make sure that the small charities and not-for-profits get access to our work. And I want to think about how do we help build capability, not just for the organisations we might do work for, but for other people who might benefit from this. So, I mean, it's a tiny example, but it's just those pieces where we have the opportunity to go in and be, you know, what can we not be complicit with? I think that's a really nice list. I'm worried about the Q&A, and I know I've got moderators that will be really anxious about me getting to questions. So
can I just say, Kristy, it is about being prepared to lose to win.
Yeah.
You're not going to, if you don't take a risk and you're not prepared to lose. I remember being in a room with Pat McGorry for 2 hours, having this argument with him, trying to get him not to do something in order to gain a win. You know, you really need to recognise that winning sometimes means giving away things. And it's not always about maintaining the programs and services if what you're working for is a better community outcome.
Yeah. And I really like that piece around, you know, lift your gaze so it's not about us or our organisations, but let's think about what purpose we exist for. That's really lovely. Nicola, do you want to come in and ask any pointed questions today?
Yeah, look, there's no danger of not having enough questions. Let me say that much. There's been a lot of discussion and a lot of good chat going on. Before I kick off with the first question, there was a comment there before that said, are there frameworks for practical collaboration or resources that you can recommend? And I was just wondering if we could open that up to the hive mind here, and if people could share some links in the chat, that would be great. And we'll make sure that everybody else gets the links and everything after the webinar. But first question is from Sandy. How do you combat a flooding of charities into a governed subsector? For instance, veteran support has around 5,000 registered. What strategies have you found to reduce fratricide among these charities?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really interesting area. Partly because I just cannot believe the risk that exists in that sector. I went to Legacy's, I was asked to speak at Legacy's conference, and you walk into the room and the room's divided into places. So there's place tags on the desks, and there were 100 different places, and they all had their own organisations and all operated independently. And each of them had their own board, their own staff, their own fundraisers, their own, and they were all using the Legacy name. And, you know, I was looking at them and I said, so what's your biggest issue? You know, if I come in here as someone from the outside, what's the biggest issue for Legacy? And they said, not enough dead soldiers is their big issue, because, you know, they're there to support people who've died. And I said, so how, given that there's probably not going to be enough dead soldiers, and the dead soldiers we have now get better looked after than ever before, you know, I'm not trying to be flippant about that, but our support for families and others for people who've died in Afghanistan and elsewhere are much better than they were historically. I said, so what are you thinking of transitioning to? And every one of those groups had their own little ideas about what they should be doing. And I think unless people are prepared to do the work about who they really serve and what their purpose is, I think you're vulnerable. And I think that whole organisation is vulnerable. And I think the individual legacies are vulnerable. And, if you try and encourage them to work together and develop some common goals around who they serve and how they could do that better, it takes an incredible amount of resourcing that they don't have. And I think that's a situation for many charities who probably need to reimagine what they can do and reconnect with their communities to better respond to their communities. But the capacity to do that when you're also trying to run your programs and you haven't got enough money and you need funding to last the year out is really limited. And I think that really is the biggest challenge, the immediate pressure of survival against the demand to actually do the kinds of things Kristy and I are talking about, the longer term planning, the focusing on your outcomes, the better measurement, the collaboration. That all requires resources. And we're already in a resource-stretched environment. So how do we facilitate that? And that's a challenge for Kristy and CSI. I know that Kristy's talked about how they as an institution can better support that. It's a challenge for CCA. We're constantly thinking about how can we support our members to do some of this work that we think is about transformation of the sector to be more responsive to their communities.
I mean, I think I agree with David. It's such a good question, Sandy, and it's a question not just in the veteran space, but in other social issue areas as well, where we have a myriad of charities with a similar purpose, but actually all working in silos. And I think that work that David's talking about around how do we go back to the beneficiary, what's our purpose, and then what does the ecosystem look like in the problem we're trying to solve and what role do we all play is really key. And the challenge with the collaboration stuff, like David says, is there's a resource one, but there's also an ego one in a way, and it might not be intentional, but just that sense of you've got to have the time and space to look beyond your organisation and say, hey, who else might we partner with and how do we do this? And you also have to have good intermediaries who are independent largely to help you do that. So I think those are important challenges that we need to kind of work on. I think at the same time, in answering some of that question, I think we have a danger of a conversation about amalgamation. And sometimes, we have to be worried about the loss of small charities. And we've seen that we say, things like the NDIS and marketisation and what thin markets actually mean for people's lives. There is no market to service a kid in a rural regional area with challenging behaviour and severe intellectual disabilities. From my 10 years in disability work, I know how much work and care the families and the carers have to give in that space. So that, a market mechanism doesn't work. And if we come from this from a how do we all combine, we lose sense of who the beneficiary is and how we best support them. So I think there's a way to balance this piece around when do we need that localised, grounded piece, but then how does that look at an organisational level so that we don't end up with 3,000 different organisations with the same purpose and duplication of resources, etc.
Can I make one practical suggestion? Close down for a period of time. And I know people find that really difficult. In all the agencies I've worked in, there's shock and horror when I say, actually, we need 2 weeks out to work through these issues. But you can, we worked around skeleton staff in drug treatment, or, I first did this in a youth welfare agency in Grasmere, youth services in Dandenong. And we actually closed the service so that we could think better and concentrate and bring other people in from the community and from outside the community to actually say, well, what are we trying to do here and how can we do it better?
I think it's adding to that practical suggestion, if people are going to, whether they close down or take pause to have the space to do it. I think organisations, this will count for businesses, and I want to come back to actually we've got to work out how to bring in business as well into this whole thing because they're really key. But organisations probably now need to be relooking at the organisation level theory of change and resetting that because the ecosystem has changed. The environment looks very different. So that's the other practical step piece of advice that I'd add to that. Nick, did you want to add other questions?
Yeah, there's a lot. I've got a sort of two-parter from Chris, who asks, what's the merit of charities acting as contractors for government services rather than raising philanthropic funds and providing services which aren't covered by government? And do the ministers who are anti-charity want to take over their services and provide them as government services?
The ministers, I'll start with the last one first. The ministers who are opposed to charities, Michaelia Cash actually wrote to the Queen asking the Royal be removed from the RSPCA. The reason that she's opposed to the RSPCA is they're pro-animals and she's not. And RSPCA campaign, no testing on animals of cosmetics and various other campaigns, which she opposes. So generally, what people want is charities to be silent, but do their work meeting whatever needs aren't being met by the market, so the market failure spaces. So they want you to pick up the rubbish at the side of the stream and clear the dead fish out of the stream, but don't go up to the factory up the road that's poisoning the stream and try and stop them putting poison in, because that's advocacy. So there's a strong group who believe that charity is about helping the poor, not advocating against poverty. That's just a reality. The question about whether we should be accepting government funding, it's actually a really serious question. I know many people will just go, well, if people have a problem and we can get government funding to address that problem, why wouldn't we take the funding? For me, it is about the terms of that engagement. If you are responding to a community need that's very real, it's very appropriate to accept government funding, provided you can respond. But I do think that you've got to be careful about the commodification of services. So, I talked briefly about, I mentioned that I'd worked at Crosbie Youth Services. I remember once I got a call from Endeavour Hills Tech School, which is a pretty tough school in those days, saying that kids were coming back after lunch having sniffed petrol and they were causing problems. And so I went and talked to the kids, and some of whom I knew, and they were buying petrol in 20-cent bags from the local service station. The service station was giving them plastic bags at 20 cents worth of petrol. So that's not hard to fix. I went and talked to the petrol station owner, and initially he was a bit reluctant, but it didn't take much to convince him. And he stopped selling 20-cent bags of petrol. I talked to the kids and said, look, you can't do this during school, and this is the kind of thing that will happen. And I sent some information home to all their parents, and I addressed the staff meeting for about 15-20 minutes and talked about contagion and the concerns around solvents generally, and how the patterns of behaviour tended to form and pass through areas, and that overreaction would be a problem. Then not one of those interventions was supported financially. It was not one, I didn't have to unpack that and say, I ran a drug education program for kids. I ran a community intervention program for the supplier. I ran a parent education program. I ran a teacher training program. I didn't have to commodify everything that I did, because Crosbie Youth Services was there in the community to serve local youth, particularly youth at risk. And I was a probation officer and I had a client load, but we also had enough space to work with the local community. To me, it's that direct engagement as an organisation in your community that provides your strength. And if you overly allow yourself to be commodified into episodes of care, then that critical work that makes you valued can be undermined. So I think we need to rethink some of our contracting of government so that it is about actually responding to people rather than providing specified episodes of care.
I think there's been some other, I won't say too much because I know there'll be other questions to ask, but I think there's been some other interesting examples where we've seen some charities go into entire other areas of care or service giving that isn't part of their core purpose. And that's been just to exist, survive, get funding, or there's an opportunity to kind of scale their organisation, as opposed to it being about what's actually best for the beneficiary, or who else might we partner with to enable this to happen, or, you know, how do we share resources that might help somebody else who's really well placed to do this but might not be competitive in the tendering. So I think that's probably some of the thinking that we also need to be mindful of. Nick?
Yeah, another question, and I'll direct this one to you in the first instance, Kristy. Kate asks, in regards to the present crisis, what should charities be doing now to ensure their continued viability and survival? And what supports are available and necessary to stay alive so they can build back better in the future?
There's a number of things that I'm going to start with the supports, and then I'll go back to sort of local level charity response. There are a number of things that are happening at a more national kind of big picture level. So the Charities Crisis Cabinet, through David and others' leadership, is doing a whole bunch of work around how do we change things around philanthropic funding, you know, what might we need to challenge around funding models, how do we make volunteering easier, who are the people being left behind in terms of, you know, charities that need support, etc. So there's a whole lot of work going on, and David and some others have some really great, you know, connections to government, and there's been some really important conversations that have been going on with ministers, etc., and have been strong advocates and influencers around things like JobKeeper. We're starting to talk about, you know, how do we think about charities going forward when JobKeeper stops, and, you know, when do you advocate to push it along? How do we support charities when they might fall off the cliff edge? So all of that work is happening in a fairly big picture way. And I guess, you know, through David or CSI, we'd love to hear about other support needs that people are interested in. There are a couple of other big picture things going on. To David's point around evidence and policy and what do we need to build back better and what does build back better look like, we think that we need a whole lot of more focus on how do we collect rigorous longitudinal evidence. So we've had, you know, improvements in the ACNC data, but it doesn't tell us enough about outcomes, for example. We know that a lot of charities don't have the resources that they need to be able to do the work that David was talking about around outcome measurement. So, you know, for a couple of years, CSI has been working on Amplify Social Impact. Pretty excited to be super close to launching our indicator engine resource, which charities will be able to go into and type in their purpose, and it will help suggest indicators so that they can easily measure outcomes and track those. A rigorous system with validated questions and benchmark data. So there's sort of that piece of support. And then the other one that at least CSI is just embarking on is a big project that you may have seen around how do we track the pulse of the sector? So how do we do that longitudinal data collection to see how people are doing now? And we're looking at doing a survey every, not just of charities, but of the for-purpose sector, so social enterprises and other sort of legal forms who are there for social good. Doing a national survey a couple of times a year for the next few years so we can get some really good data, as well as doing a bunch of deep dives so we can take particular issue areas and say what's going on here and what can we learn from other productivity commission reviews or other things that we know about in the past or where we're at right now to do that build back better piece. And then as far as local charities are concerned, as individuals, I really support, you know, a bunch of David's recommendations around taking the time to pause and finding the balance between not just being in crisis mode, but also thinking about how you hold recovery and what that might look like. I think organisations that can hold those in parallel will do best. And in part for charities, I think it is going back to things like, well, what's our purpose? People are good at that. What's the work we do, and is that still servicing what we need, or is there some kind of reimagining? There's some amazing examples internationally and locally where, you know, charities that used to be. I'm just thinking about one I read yesterday about a kitchen in India, of all places. They used to think, okay, we give out 5 million. It was 2 million meals. And they wanted to go to 5 million in scale of meals, but because of COVID, they couldn't be producing these meals. So they've shifted their entire focus to say, how do we actually change what we do to meet our purpose? And they're now delivering rice and lentils, and putting supports in place to enable people to cook food locally. And all of a sudden, they've gone from 2 million, and they had this aspiration to serve 5, and now they're reaching over 20 million people with almost a flick of thinking. So I think there are opportunities at all sorts of levels.
David, did you have anything further to add to that one?
Yeah, I think we're actually quite well served in Australia. I think our community has some fantastic resources about getting people back to work post-COVID. I know some of my members have used their guidelines for setting up their offices and stuff post-COVID. There's some really good resources around IT at Info Exchange. I think Volunteering Australia now has some good guidelines around reintegrating volunteers in the current situation. And, I agree the bigger picture stuff from CSI around outcomes is really critical. But I do think we have we're quite well served in Australia with access to those kinds of, like the governance issues with not-for-profit law and Justice Connect. We have some fantastic organisations offering that kind of support to our charities, and the more we use them, the better. And I know many of them have pivoted to make sure that they're providing COVID-19 relevant information and guidelines for charities. And some are starting to look at post-COVID issues as well.
I know we have to wrap up, and so I think, maybe just one last, what's your hope for the future, David? And I might just, do you have one thing you'd say as your hope for the future?
Yeah, look, I actually think in some ways engagement has become easier and more acceptable, engagement between people. And we need to build on that. And as charities seize that opportunity, I think we kind of have a window now. It's not so silly to knock on a neighbour's door or knock on someone's door and say, are you interested in this, as it was 12 months ago to me. I think we're more interested in being connected, particularly locally. And that provides an incredible opportunity. And if we could have charities engage more with their communities and with their supporters and their stakeholders, I think that provides a really solid foundation for all the other changes that we need to make. And, just to sort of finish up, we've almost have a license to rethink what we do. And you don't often get that kind of license. We need to use it.
Thanks, David. And as everyone goes off and uses that license to be different and be amazing, I'm hopeful because I know that I get to work with amazing leaders every day, many of whom are on this call. So we have a wealth of knowledge and talent that can help us get there in this Build Back Better stage. Thank you, David, for joining me. Thank you, everybody, for joining another one of CSI's Impact 2020 webinars. Nick, I'll hand back to you to quickly wrap up.
Thanks. There was a lot of questions that we didn't get to. I'll make sure that they're circulated with the team, and we'll be following up with everybody after this anyway, and you'll get a copy of the recording as well. But thanks, everyone. Thanks for the discussion, and thanks for being here today. It's great to see you all. Okay, we'll leave it there. Bye.